This is the Open University.
Instead of flicking ink pellets from the bottom of the class, you think this down on your enormous ass and watch the Open University.
Yes, jawel. Let's go.
It's time for Ballyhoo 3 talk, and I'm kind of, it's like 10 o'clock in the morning, and I've got this beautiful scintillating sunshine on my kitchen floor. Kind of terrified it's going to disappear before I have finished my notes for this album talk, which is slightly more relaxed this time because I'm sitting down. And as a kind of preamble, I wanted to talk about moral panics and technology, because there's always a sense that new technology is disruptive and is going to not only deprive people of their livelihoods, the craftsmen who are already doing well from a particular technology, but also corrupt and deprave. And that's part of the promotional push of every new technology, is that there's almost a calculated provocation of moral panics, because these are the best promotion, the best publicity. When the stick in the muds and the conservatives get annoyed about something and say it's the end of the world, or that it's going to, undermine us or undermine our children or whatever. So I think moral panics are fine as well. I'm not condemning them, because it's a way of thinking about our habits and what purpose they serve, our formats and our habits, and whether, it might not be actually quite good to change them. So the classic example is when photography came along, and painting up until that point had as a large part of its raison d'etre the reproduction of the visible. In other words, taking photographs, you would take a portrait of someone in a painting rather than a photograph. And of course, all that stuff got knocked for six by the arrival of chemical photography in the 19th century, and painting had to change. So being an artist, circa 1910, suddenly became about a whole different set of attributes. It was no longer, as Paul Klee famously said, about reproducing the visible, but about making visible, which is a kind of mystical statement. How does art make visible? Well, it really throws a wobbly kind of googly ball at us and makes us consider how we look and what seeing is. And, it makes us examine our looking and examine the visible world, and also do other things, like Marcel Duchamp started referring to painting as retinal, certain kinds of painting as purely retinal, and so he brought in this whole new conceptual thing into art. So the artist's role became much larger and much more shamanic and perhaps mystical as a result of the arrival of photography to take care of the more tedious things. So in terms of AI coming along, what is it replacing? What is it going to displace us from? Well, just putting together chords and, doing the kind of tedious compositional tasks, which are artisanally, very important and continue to be very important, but might be, it's like a building contractor rather than an architect. An architect comes in with vision and says, what is the meaning and the context and what can we do that's exciting and new and original? So all these questions of, higher order questions of originality start to assume more importance when the basics are taken care of, when there's a construction manager or something taking care. So AI is our construction manager in terms of songwriting. I'm still not defending it. I'm not saying it's a great development. It is disruptive capitalism at its worst, in a sense. But it's been very exciting, and I'm very excited about this album now, because it made me do things I don't normally do as a songwriter. It took me into sounds and areas which I couldn't have achieved on my own. Or with musicians, arguably. So, it's made me pay more attention to the world, I think, and the higher order of, what is a song, the catnip of songs, which I used to talk about when I was making the Hypnoprism album, which was about discovering YouTube. It was really about the arrival of the archive of all possible musics on YouTube from the past, and then saying, well, what are the really catnipy ones? What are the ones that have appealed to me over the decades? And what if I try and do something a bit like that? So this is really like a second wind of that, a second arrival of a technology which excites me because it opens up, this time, a kind of imaginary parallel world archive of non-existent song, not already existing songs, but things which are quite close to or inspired in a weird way by existing songs. So it's the archive again, but it's also a parallel world archive, which makes it super exciting for me because I've always been, as you know, into parallel worlds. I think we'll survive by changing, adapting to this new technology and adapting what a songwriter is as a result, because it's still super important to be human and to have a human perspective. Otherwise it's just robots making pretty sounds, So okay, the last 6 tracks, they may be the last entirely, or there might be one more thing as usual. Okay, this starts with Plastic Soul, which I was working on August 15th, and I put a prompt into Audio which said I want a muted K-pop song using mostly harpsichords and Rhodes piano, funky in an early 80s UK Brit funk way. So quite specific, and it came up with this this funky number.
Life for cut photo shoot down at Sinsadon, heading up to Sanya where they're showing Park Chan-kyung. Sunset on the river, sunset through the fumes. Sun is setting on the west if you can read the runes. And F is the dumpster girl, Marshall is the brains. Carrie Cakes is wholesome, but she's a little strange. Hip dunked in Plaza, it's always August there. If you're not in Seoul, you where? Nowhere.
Originally, I was thinking about ACR, A Certain Ratio, on Factory Records in the early 80s, who I was very much into. In the early 80s, we were nervous, uptight white guys, a bit on the model of David Byrne, getting into black music, but with a totally different mindset and a different feeling of uptight, kind of ascetic, schizoid, all these words, a kind of uptight energy which you see in the dancing that David Byrne prepared for the Stop Making Sense film and tour. So it's funky, but it's also, funk means fear. So there is a kind of, you can see this fear of music thing which happens at the end of the 70s with the cold wave and new wave music, where they get funky, but in a very scared way. It is literally funky in the sense of, you're dancing because you're afraid, or it's an alternative to fear of what's happening in the world, in geopolitics and in politics, with Thatcher and Reagan coming along. So all these funk possibilities appear which are nervous and uptight funk. And a little bit that with ACR, my first idea for this track was to make it something like All Night Party, which was, I think, ACR's first single. And it's about, going to a disco and feeling jealous or something. And the All Night Party goes on. But the All Night Party doesn't sound like much fun in ACR's reading of it. And later, this is the ironic thing in the 80s, is that what we were all doing started out as kind of ironic commentary. The same with Scritti Politti. Ironic commentary on pop and its snares and its entrapment of our mentalities. But then falling in love increasingly with pop itself and passing off our pastiches as the real thing. So, and I was doing this too, like Hairstyle of the Devil is kind of a pastiche of mainstream pop, but then it becomes a kind of pop hit, gets played on daytime Radio 1 and stuff. So, that was my little entryism as well. Were we being corrupted by the medium itself? Possibly we were, but, it's a corruption based on love and affection. And I think a lot of the nervous funksters also, like ACR later they got a black drummer and became a very tight, a real funk band, and later on it gets a bit boring. I mean, they just released an album like last year or something. It's still good, it's still interesting, but it sounds a bit laptop-y and it sounds a bit like they've lost that tension between the chaos and the kind of out-of-tuneness of the first album, for instance, which has those amazing out-of-tune trumpets on it. Sounds like Public Image Limited trying to play funk, you know, something like that. That collision of new wave, cold wave with, or post-punk rather, with black idioms of the time was very exciting. So Plastic Soul is it started with this ACR idea, and you know, it was going to be called Barabbas at one point, and of course it had a Shack Attack and Shalimar kind of feeling. In Britain in the early 80s we had a lot of bands which were kind of a bit inspired by Heatwave and people like that from America, who were kind of doing very slick, or George Benson, or all sorts of people were doing this amazingly slick, Stevie Wonder, whatever, music in the States. And then we got a British version of that. Producer, you know, bands put together really by musos. Shack Attack were mostly white band, you know, very muso, session musician-y kind of keyboard players. But they picked up on this idiom. That kind of left a mark on me, and so Plastic Soul is my tribute to that moment. So I joked on Facebook that I just needed Mark King to play slap bass, and it could almost be level 42. There were so many people doing it. Blancmange, you know, when I had my band The Happy Family, Blancmange had an album called Happy Families, which was, you know, about dancing on the ceiling and all the rest of it. I was slightly annoyed with Blancmange because they were like almost a proto Pet Shop Boys, an electronic duo who were doing post Talking Heads, post Shriekback kind of funky music with synthesizers. Or there were indie people like Thomas Lear, who was a fellow Scot on Cherry Red, doing fantastic kind of electronic versions of Young Americans in the early 80s. He had a great album called Contradictions. So this is a great thematic opener for Ballyhoo. Plastic Soul. It just shows it. The lyric in the end turned into a kind of a guided tour to soul, and all the stuff that I'd been experiencing in my holidays in Seoul last year. So I downloaded 300 or so photographs from my month in Seoul, and then played them very fast. Yeah, it's a good new opener for the album, I think, because it's a K-pop album as well as an AI album. The next track was Reshape. And that started in Suno with a prompt, very minimal electronic funk soul jazz from 1975. I've been listening a lot to tracks like Get Down Saturday Night by Oliver Cheetham, which is actually from 83, so it's a bit later. But it's in the same idiom. And also things like the whispers, the beat goes on. So there's an amazing little synth tone in that, which kind of goes, and again, it's this kind of moment when disco and synthesizers cross over. Obviously, Donna Summer is the classic example of that, working in Munich with Giorgio Moroder. But in America also, it was a new technology of synthesizers and electronic instruments coming in and being used by black artists in an interesting new way. To bring this back at the moment of AI is to question your identity, really. And so I started, this line appeared in my head, do the songs write me? Do I write the songs or do the songs write me? Because it is almost a moment in which humanity is going to be dépassé, you know, it's going to be the machines taking over. They're going to be thinking for us, and they will in a sense be thinking us. We will become their thoughts rather than them being our thoughts. Luckily at the moment they're still primitive, they're still in nappies, you know, and they still make mistakes and shit on the floor and stuff. And that's a good moment, because they haven't yet become slick enough to pass as us. They haven't yet passed the Turing test. In pop music they're getting close to it, but I think the lyrics really let them down, so I'm not using many AI generated lyrics at all, just here and there. And they're deliberately showcased in the songs to sound bad. So this idea of the songs write me, and also it's like Bowie's Young Americans, again, an Englishman losing his identity in America with the background mythology of an alien from space losing his identity on Earth, or assuming a false identity on Earth in order to raise a lot of money and go back to his home planet. This idea of being out of your depth, being the white fly in the black milk. Who can I be now? It's the quintessential AI identity crisis song. So Reshape is, you know, I didn't initially think of it as the AI itself singing this. and having an identity crisis about who it is as it assumes intelligence bit by bit. But actually somebody commented on YouTube that it was actually the AI singing, and I thought that's a really nice interpretation. I'm going to pretend that was my intention in the first place. It wasn't. I mean, it was really like a person, a human, feeling that they'd been stoned and dethroned by this new technology. So actually Reshape has a relationship with working from home. This is where, at the moment, again, where I feed my older songs into the engines and get new songs from them. So I fed Working From Home from the Vivid album into Suno, and it made a new song about gliding into the night. So I use quotations of the synthetic voice singing that, and it's a Suno version of my voice, so it still sounds like me, but it's Suno kind of pretending to be me singing Working From Home, but making it into a much more glossy, kind of nauseatingly normal ballad but spooky at the same time, spooky as hell, about gliding into the night.
Whispers of secrets in the dark, laughter echoes, we leave a mark. Music loud, heartbeats sing. In the night we find our link. Whoa, let's ride and drive into the night. Let's glide, stars shining so bright. Feel the beats, we're chasing dreams. Tonight's the night, or so it seems. Oh, let's ride, drive into the night.
And when you hear it, mishear it, like a Montegreen, it sounds like let's take some drugs and drive into the night, and tonight's the night, or so it seems. It's weirdly vague and weirdly trippy, and lost sounding, that little quotation. So that's Reshape, and the video, of course, just uses an AI animation of my face, in which, as usual, the AI is struggling and doesn't really know where my eye is, for instance. I didn't wear an eye patch when I was filming it. It just had the other eye, the blind eye, looks smaller and more shriveled, so it keeps disappearing in the video, and so then I become like a very robotic person in the video, and it's weird. It's like that early 80s moment when there was a group called Tick and Tock, who were like a dance group who would do this kind of robotic dancing when they appeared on Top of the Pops. It was a kind of technology anxiety moment, and they summed it up. You know, I find them fascinating because they're confronting this technological anxiety and saying, well, we're already on the side of the robots. We're already outdoing the robots at their own job, rather than the robots outdoing us at our jobs. It's a way to preemptively join the other side. I, for one, have always supported our new robot masters. So the next track was quite different, Faraday. And AI music production platforms, if you put in non-pop forms, they actually come out with some amazing things. Faraday started on the 16th of August. Udio gave me an electronic folktronic and new jazz instrumental, so they said. I'd asked for a startling reggae dub influenced by Japanese folk music. It gave me something totally different, and it sounded beautiful. It sounded like a cymbalom, which is a Hungarian instrument, which is kind of like the insides of a grand piano, which you play with mallets. It's got this kind of juddering kind of string mallet sound to it. Or it could be a dobro lap steel guitar a little bit, that kind of metallic, flat sound. And then it had this beautiful sax which came in, so I added stand-up bass, tenor sax and clarinet, and made it a kind of woodwind trio jazz sound. And the rising notes in that started to suggest side 2 of low and Eastern Europe, Warzawa obviously on low, because cymbalom is an East European instrument anyway. because it took me in that direction, I made this made-up language like Bowie did on Low Side 2, where the words kind of don't mean anything. It sounds like you're listening to foreign language music you don't understand, and the vocalization is still very moving to you. A bit like what I'm doing with Korean on this album as well. It's still very meaningful and moving, despite the fact that the words are meaningless, purely semantically. And it might as well be a made-up language. So all this Caroline, driving me, Shirley, it's just the pure language of emotion, and all the more effective for not making sense. It's not making sense again. So I put Bowie into the video. He's doing Sense of Doubt in an Italian recording studio, the RCA studios in Rome, actually, in October 1977, just having finished Heroes. And he's really posing as if he's in the studio at Hansa. He's posing with these various bizarre synthesizers and things, and just occasionally hitting notes on them. But, you know, a master poser, Bowie. And he's sort of channeling Stockhausen, I always think, in this period, where you see him live coming onto the stage in the stage tour in 1978 to play Warzawa with this gravity, this seriousness, which is, I always think it's kind of like he's being Stockhausen. He's recreating that moment in the 60s when everyone was sort of enthralled to Stockhausen's futuristic feeling. The sax were already there. Bowie, because he was sort of touching keyboards in the video, I actually added some new instruments like a microtonal organ, which I made myself by skewing all the tunings in world scales again, just to give Bowie something to do. Or because Bowie was hitting the low strings, the low notes on a piano for Sense of Doubt, I put in some low piano as well. So it's sort of, often this is how it works. Like I'll make a song, and then when I make the video, there are people doing things in the video, like hitting cymbals or whatever. So I have to hit a cymbal. This happened in the Fox in Winter track as well, because I put in foxes. I don't know if they'll be on the master recording now. I think the foxes are slightly distracting. They cover up some of the musical bits that I like the most in the video. But for Faraday, it definitely was improved by the microtonal organ. And a Faraday cage. Faraday is like the only real word in the whole piece. Faraday was the name of the inventor of the Faraday cage. And I always think a recording studio is a bit like a Faraday cage. A Faraday cage is just an environment which is isolated from electromagnetic signals of all kinds, so that you don't interfere with experiments and things happening in there, because they're all around us. There's a lot of radio waves and atmospheric radiation and activity of various kinds. So a Faraday cage is kind of like when you're making an album, you're in a kind of Faraday cage. It's a good metaphor for the isolation of how I make albums. Anyway, I know a lot of people make albums in a very cooperative way. I make them in a very isolated way. So the video for this shows David Sylvian in Berlin in the Hansa studio with Sakamoto and others in 1984 recording Brilliant Trees, one of my favorite albums of all time. It also shows Julius Eastman in 1974 performing Stay On It. It also shows clips of Yvonne Rainer's 1979 or 1980 film, Journeys from Berlin, 1970. It's called Journeys from Berlin, 1971, and it shows her, well, she's really thinking and talking and just finding visual correlatives for talking about how she saw life in Berlin at that point. I saw it in the film festival in Edinburgh in 1980 and was really impressed by it. I just remember this one line about there will be no steerage on spacecraft leaving the Earth. It was the kind of late 70s angst again that I keep returning to, and it was my late teenage angst at the time as well. The next track, Klepto Glade, goes back to June the 9th when I was in the bath making OU jingles, and I asked Udio for a vaudeville song played on monophonic synthesizers. It came up with something it described as playful art pop and humorous, but also death. There's apparently a category of death as a genre, as a music genre. had this quirky up-tempo energy, a bit like M's pop music. And I pushed that through a lot of transformations, sort of emphasizing the really brutal bass, because audio is really good at bass and drums. I don't like often what it does on top, but it's much better than, say, GarageBand for generating drum loops. It doesn't use drum loops. I mean, it uses this kind of techno-influenced, exciting percussion patterns where there's kind of amen breaks and things like that, and then kind of crazy rolls and very funky bass lines always. So it's like you're working with the best session musicians and drum programmers, and in a sense you are working with their ghosts. So I pushed it through a lot of transformations, and I kept the craziest and most abrasive and aggressive bits focusing on the rhythm section. And I had this lyric sitting up to one side called "Thou Shalt Not," which was obviously influenced by Israel Gaza, saying we've forgotten the "Thou Shalt Not Kill" part of the Ten Commandments. And it was kind of schematic in a way I can be in my songs, like, you know, My Kindly Friend the Censor or something like that, where there's a consistent trope or metaphor, rhetorical device guiding the whole song and the whole lyric. And these days I tend to be bored with that. I don't want to do that, and I tend to put that aside and just bring in fragments of that, the more startling imagery, and then mix it in with kind of random stuff or mondegreens or whatever. So I kind of did that, lost the schematic kind of side of that, and just interspersed random imagery from, you know, descriptions of my Tumblr photos, for instance, the thing about the amateur painting sat by the door and the Japanese, it was just sort of impressions of exhibitions I'd seen at the time. This is an angry song, a bit like Bartleby the Scrivener, or, you know, there's a darker energy underneath the very up-tempo and aggressive music. So then in the video where you get these Korean, these K-pop girls dancing behind me, it's like there's some kind of, you know, political dimension which would never normally be in a K-pop song. K-pop is very tightly controlled in terms of what it can say. It can talk about your vagina in K-pop. Well, it's couched in metaphors, you know, here's the cookie jar and that kind of thing, but you know very well what the cookie jar is. It was also, actually, talking of random exhibitions that I'd seen coming into songs, I'd seen a show at Kunstwerk here in Berlin by an artist called Pia Arke, and it was called Arctic Hysteria. And she'd looked at the way, apparently there was this phenomenon observed by psychologists of the early 20th century of Arctic hysteria, where women, at the onset of winter in the Arctic, women would do crazy things and scream and go mad and run amok. So she started researching this, and she went to the Explorers Club in New York and asked for a copy of a photograph showing a naked Eskimo woman, Inuit woman, being dragged away because she was apparently running amok because of this so-called Arctic hysteria. Pia Arka wanted to make an artwork about this, and so when she asked permission from the New York Explorers Club to use a photograph of this naked woman, they refused the permission, saying it was too controversial. They didn't want their archives used for this kind of political stuff, apparently. It's kind of interesting to me because there's a Bowie angle to the Explorers Club, which is that when Lodger came out, he did a little press junket thing in the Explorers Club in New York. Because his album had a travelogue theme and a world music theme, he used the Explorers Club, which is a very snooty kind of Upper East Side environment in New York. So there are some beautiful photographs of Bowie looking very fresh, and sort of the Bowie I identify most with is the 1979 Bowie, when he's, for instance, he's only selling 100,000 copies of Lodger when it comes out. It really cratered in terms of his sales, but it's the kind of album I love because it's so quirky and eccentric, you know, African Night Flight and stuff like that. But yeah, he's pictured there with RCA sales staff at the Explorers Club in New York on the Upper East Side. Yeah, so that was Klepto Glade, and it's the most abrasive track. You know, it sort of reminds me a little bit of Influence of Village, a couple of albums ago. And then the last track, the final track we made just yesterday, it's called Three Trapped Tigers. It was going to be called Milk White Room, or it was going to be called Beautiful Vagina at one point. So I asked Udio for a playful K-pop contemporary R&B futuristic track, and it gave me this very funky slow jam with a big bass sound.
Yo, Bell, let's go.
Three trapped tigers may ignite, hopscotch in the mountain night. Diable in the dark came near to your wild heart.
And my first thought was to put lyrics from Ultravox's Rock Rock in there, just to be incongruous. It's a very sexy lyric, actually, that John Fox wrote for Rock Rock. I was into Ultravox in the 70s, the late 70s, before Midjour came along. But it wasn't really working. And so then I had the middle section where the synthetic vocal takes over the vocal duties, and I was doing mondegreens on that section. It's all in Korean, that bit. So I had no idea what she was saying, the foxtress, the K-pop foxtress was saying. But I could hear her say something like the Magic Mountain or a Magic Mountain. And I thought, wow, yeah, the Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, she's singing about. And so I also put in Hermann Hesse's Glass Bead Game, which is a kind of vaguely similar book. And it became a tribute to some magic realism, a lot of Clarice Lispector and G. Cabrera Infante titles. In fact, the title of the song Three Trapped Tigers is a Cabrera Infante novel. I'd already visited, I'm a huge fan of his novel Infante's Inferno, which describes him being corrupted as a teenager by discovering this book called Lusts of a Moron, which of course is a title I took from my own lyrics collection. In Cuba, he was brought up in Cuba, and so it's about his sexual awakening, that novel. It's classic South American, colourful, magic realist, but also confessional narrative. So for the video, I photographed about a fifth of my books on my table in my library. I've got a huge collection of dusty old books here. I couldn't be bothered photographing all of them, obviously, but I took the first few shelves. And then put these Korean dancers in front. So there's this nice contrast between the stillness of the books and the energy of the dancers. And it was there, when I originally thought, is she singing about Thomas Mann? This kind of incongruity is what really interests me in this project, where you make something in a genre very generic, and then you kind of shatter the genre by putting in something which would never normally coexist with that. And this is something AI will never really do, unless it's really forced to. If you force its nose into a collided genre, it might come up with something interesting. Generally, though, but it's still quirky enough to do this. So the Mondegreen lyric in the midsection, she's singing Korean, but I heard her saying, "Beautiful vagina now, you're mounting the mountain of the eiderdown in a sachet, in a ballet, in the milk white room. I'd rather have a catchy mouth, getting eager not to read the magic mountain, a sweet bed given up for you."
Beautiful vagina now, you're mounting the mountain of the eiderdown in a sachet, in a ballet, in a milk white room.
I think it's a song that captures the glitchiness of AI better than any of the others on this album, because I left in the really weird. I always laugh every single time I play this. I laugh especially at the end, the weird voices saying, "Yes, you're down, buck up, ha ha." That's the latest and probably the last track. And Swishy has been dropped. I thought Swishy was just a sort of a bit of an interruption in the flow, because mostly it has a black energy, this album. It has that early 80s black heatwave, George Benson, slick funk. And I don't know why really that interested me, except that K-pop is also interested in that sort of early 80s style of black music, and is updating it. So putting contemporary productions around that kind of chord sequence. There it is, and it's somebody left a beautiful comment yesterday under the latest track saying, this is shaping up to be some of the most interesting music I've heard this year. it's going to be a great album. So I hope it is, and now I'm going to think about the sleeve. I'm thinking about using this painting as the sleeve, but maybe running it through AI and sort of morphing the features into my features a little bit. So who knows, but that's enough for now. See you next time. Talking not about music, but about life.
Open University.
This is BBC Two.